Jonah Hull reporting there from the Greek island of Lesbos. Well, joining us now from Washington, D.C. is Brian Hansford, a spokesperson for the UN High Commission for Refugees. Mr. Hansford, thank you so much for joining us here on Al Jazeera. We're really seeing in those reports how the situation is intensifying in all different parts of Europe, all different sorts of hotspots. And now, just remind us, what are the international obligations of all these countries as they receive refugees?
Well, certainly, thank you. I mean, what your reports have shown, deadly chaos in the Mediterranean and in these European countries. And what we're calling for, as the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, the UN refugee agencies, is primarily for humane reception of people. You know, countries have international obligations to accept people, obligations as well to keep open the borders. Because as your report showed, many of these people, if not most of these people, are fleeing from conflict. Conflict in Syria, conflict in Afghanistan, conflict in South Sudan, Eritrea and elsewhere. So the immediate response must be a humanitarian one, a humane reception facility and management of the borders. It's a very complex situation, but saving lives, protecting people must be the first response.
I'm sure most people would agree with that, except that the leaders of pretty much all of these countries and other countries, the UK, if we're thinking of the situation in Calais, in Italy, dealing with a lot of the arrivals in Lampedusa, will say that they need European help. And we've all been saying for months now how there hasn't been a European-wide strategy. From your point of view, what do you think, assuming that the countries would agree to it, what do you think should be the EU policy for this?
Well, absolutely. There needs to be a European-wide response. This is not a Greek problem. This is not a French problem, as you mentioned, Calais. This is not a British problem. This is not a German problem. This is a European-wide problem which needs a European-wide response, a European crisis response.
What shape do you think that response should take? So, forgive me for interrupting, but just being specific, for example, should there be sorting centres in the main arrival countries like Greece and Italy? Who should run them? Who should fund them? How do you see the actual practical solution?
Sure. Certainly, this year we've seen around 300,000 desperate people crossing the Mediterranean by sea alone. So there should be reception centres in these countries and European funding, European support for, say, reception centres in Greece or Italy, where most of the people have arrived. And they should be, the people should be allowed to describe their situation. As I say, most of the people are from, many if not most of the people are from conflict countries, Afghanistan, Syria, South Sudan, elsewhere. So there should be humane conditions, protection. Our staff, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, UN Refugee Agency staff are on the border working with the governments in many cases, but working also with volunteers and our other partners on the ground. But as you say, the response so far has been inadequate. There needs to be common European solidarity and responsibility sharing among the European countries. This is not, when you consider, for example, and I was in Lebanon recently in March this year, 25% of the population of Lebanon is a Syrian refugee. That's 1 in 4 of the country. And most of the Syrian refugees, over 4 million of them, are in the regional countries. And what this reflects in Europe is inadequate response to support in those regional countries with the Syrian refugees. And so in desperation, desperate people resort to desperate measures with people smugglers, and they cross into Europe.
You mentioned Lebanon, 1 in 4 there, a refugee. I mean, Turkey, of course, is the other country, much bigger, obviously. But you released figures from the 25th of August saying that now there's just under 2 million refugees in Turkey itself. I mean, we're seeing this push towards Europe. I'm wondering if it's related to, I guess, what we could call the saturation of the neighbouring countries around Syria, of being able to host many of these refugees coming out of Syria. So I'm wondering if more money was directed at many of the refugee centres there, do you think we would see fewer people making the dangerous journey into Europe?
Well, certainly, I think, as you mentioned, saturation point. Again, I was in Lebanon, 1.2 million Syrian refugees. Turkey, as you mentioned, with more Syrian refugees than any other country, almost 2 million. It is these countries are at saturation point. More funds need to be directed to these countries because the Syrians themselves are desperate. The Lebanese and the Turks and the Jordanians in particular have been very generous in keeping their borders open, but it's a desperate situation as the war in Syria is now into its 5th year. And our our regional response plan, the UN Refugee Agency, with our partners, with our UN partners and others, the plan for the region, for the Syria region, is less than 40% funded. So certainly more funding needs to be gone to that to support the Syrian refugees. But again, we're seeing a global world at war, if you will. More people have been forced to flee because of war, conflict and persecution. Around 60 million people, almost the entire population of the United Kingdom, have been forced to than at any time since the Second World War.
That is a shocking figure, 60 million refugees around the world. On that note, Brian Hansford, spokesperson for the UN High Commission for Refugees, thank you so much for having spoken to us here on Al Jazeera. Thank you.
Thank you.